Scary Stories for Sleepovers by R.C. Welch. Illustrated by Ricardo Delgado. The Hermit of Collins Peak. Ricky and his friends were telling Kurt, the new boy in the neighborhood, about the strange old hermit who lived outside of town. "He's crazy," Ricky was saying. The other boys nodded. "He lives in a shack over on Collins Peak." "A shack?" Kurt asked. "I swear," said Ricky, holding up his hand. "It's true," added Steve, Ricky's best friend. "He built it against the side of the mountain with old pieces of metal and wood." Kurt shook his head. "That's really weird. Who is this guy?" Some of the boys shrugged. "His name is Collins," said Sean. "He's lived up there forever, as long as anybody can remember. That's why they call it Collins Peak." "My grandma told me once that he had a sad story," said Nathan, "but that's all she'd say." "It's a sad story, all right," agreed Ricky. "He's a crazy old man who lives in a shack." The rest of the boys laughed. "What does he do up there?" asked Kurt. "Nothing," replied Ricky. "He never talks to anyone. He never comes into town. We think he eats kids," said Steve. "What?" Kurt asked. "It's true," said Ricky. "He hates kids. Everyone at school knows it. His shack's at the end of a big field, and anytime somebody sets foot on it, he comes screaming out of nowhere. "Get out of here!" yelled Sean in his deepest voice. He pulled his head down between his shoulders and limped around in a circle. "You stupid kids, get out of here and leave me alone. If I catch you, I'll turn your backsides red," Steve added. Everyone laughed at that. "Yeah," continued Ricky. "Sometimes we dare each other to see who can get the closest to his shack before he comes charging out." "Why do you guys say he eats kids?" asked Kurt. "Well," said Ricky, his voice dropping lower as he leaned toward Kurt, "you never know where he is. He sneaks all over these hills, waiting for some kid to do something stupid, like wandering alone. Then it's all over." What happens?" Kurt asked. "He'll trap the kid, take him back to his shack, where he cooks him slowly over a fire. Then he stores the blackened body carefully so it'll last him for his next few meals. There's a pit nearby that's filled with rotten bones of every kid who's ever disappeared around here." Kurt looked at Ricky suspiciously. "And how many kids is that?" Ricky shrugged. "Don't know. But you'd better be careful or you'll be one of them." At that moment, Sean grabbed Kurt from behind and yelled, "Gotcha!" Kurt squealed and jumped, and the rest of the boys howled with laughter. "Rotten bones, yeah, right." Kurt smiled and shook his head. "Okay, you got me." After the boys recovered, Nathan said, "Who knows why he really doesn't like us to get near his stupid shack? Maybe he's got some kind of treasure hidden there. Why else would he care about anyone coming around? Heck, he's been living in those hills for ages. Who knows what he's found? Maybe he's found some kind of gold mine. Then why doesn't he spend a lot of money?" demanded Sean. "Maybe because then he knows people would come up there and kick him out," guessed Steve. "Maybe he had a partner and killed him to keep the gold for himself," Kurt suggested. They spent the rest of the afternoon making up wild stories about the old man. That night, Kurt asked his parents if they had heard about the hermit. His father shook his head, but his mother nodded, that she had heard something once. "Mrs. Beecham was telling me about him," she explained. "He used to live in town a long time ago. His wife died giving birth to his only son. Then, a few years later, his son disappeared. Apparently, he went a little crazy after that. He built some kind of house up on Collins Peak, and he's lived there ever since." "I hadn't heard that," Kurt's father said. "Is he supposed to be dangerous?" "Mrs. Beecham didn't think so. She said he's lived there longer than most of the people have in this town. He's never hurt anybody. Ricky was telling me that he hates kids and chases them away whenever they come near his shack, said Kurt. His father laughed. I can see it now. Some poor old guy living up in the hills. He must be a target for every kid within 100 miles. He turned to Kurt. I'm sure Ricky is right. This guy has probably been pestered by kids ever since he moved up there. Why don't you just leave him in peace, okay? Kurt shrugged. Sure, Dad. He bent over his plate and paid close attention to his dinner. The next day, he couldn't wait to talk to his new friends. They all met at Steve's house, and Kurt filled them in on what his mother had told him. See? Said Ricky. That just proves it. He probably hates kids because he lost his son. Let's show Kurt the shack, suggested Sean. I don't know, Kurt said. My dad said I should leave the old man alone. I think he feels sorry for him. Don't worry, said Ricky. We'll just go as far as the edge of the field. Then you can see what we're talking about. Kurt pretended to resist, but was soon heading out of town to Collins Peak with the rest of the boys. They walked to the end of Adler Road, which turned into a dirt trail, winding its way into the foothills. Ricky led them to a point where the trail began to bend around the mountain. Just up around that bend, he said to Kurt in a low voice, is the old man's field. When we get there, look toward the far end and you'll see his shack. They crept along the trail, and gradually a field was revealed. It lay to the right of the trail and was surrounded on 3 sides by steep slopes. It was about as big as a football field, and at the far end stood the Hermit's shack. To Kurt, it looked as if the shack were crouched under the oak trees, waiting to pounce on an unsuspecting child. He had no idea how it was held together. There were all different kinds and sizes of metal sheets, aluminum siding, wooden planks, and pieces of plastic. It hunched up against the side of the mountain, as if any minute it would push against the hill so as to lunge forward all the better. He lives there? Kurt asked in disbelief. That's right, said Ricky. Nice place, huh? Suddenly, the door of the shack swung open, and the old man rushed out. Kurt figured he must be more than 100 years old. His body was thin, and his bones poked through the holes in his ragged clothes. He had long white hair that stuck straight out and a scraggly beard that hung down to his chest. He looked anxiously around the clearing. The boys shrunk back into the bushes, peeking through the branches. Kurt felt as if the old man were looking straight at him. But nothing happened. The hermit began coughing, and even from where they were, Kurt could hear the horrible gasping. Then the old man ducked back into his hut. Ricky motioned to the others, and they backed away down the trail. Once out of sight of the field, they ran all the way back to Adler Road. Then they stumbled to a halt, chest heaving. See, said Nathan, he is one strange-looking old man. It sounded like he was about to die, said Ricky. The boys started walking again. They spent the rest of the day playing hide-and-seek in the overgrown weeds and bushes near the end of Adler Road. One morning, a few weeks later, Kurt was eating his breakfast when the doorbell rang. I got it, he yelled and ran to the front door. It was Sean. Kurt, get dressed. Why? What's up? Kurt let Sean in, and they went to his room. Guess what happened last night when Mr. Grafton was walking his dog? How should I know? Kurt was lacing up his shoes. What's going on? Mr. Grafton was walking that goofy German shepherd of his up around Adler Road when the dog starts going crazy. So Grafton lets the dog go, and it runs over to some bushes and starts barking. Yeah? Kurt prompted. He forgot about tying his other shoe. What was it? The old man. He had some kind of heart attack or something. So Grafton got the police and an ambulance up there, and they took the old man to the hospital. Wow, how do you know all this? Asked Kurt. Sean practically did a dance. My sister works at the hospital. She told us at breakfast this morning. Is he dead? Nah, but you know what that means. What? It means, said Sean, becoming very serious, that for the first time since I can remember, the old man is not at his shack. Kurt realized what Sean was suggesting and started a protest. Come on, Sean cut in. Ricky, Steve, and Nathan are going to meet us at Adler Road. Kurt stood up, chewing on his lip while he thought. Sean watched. Then Kurt grinned and threw his arms in the air like a champion boxer. Yes, he yelled. Let's go! The old man was dying, and he knew it. He opened his eyes and stared at the white walls of the hospital room. He hadn't been in a hospital since his son was born. He turned slowly and looked at the tube in his arm, smiling bitterly. There was no use, but try and tell that to a doctor. Yes, he knew he was dying. He had known it since the coughing began, nearly 6 months ago. First, he thought he had a slight cold, or maybe bronchitis at the worst. But the cough never went away. After the first couple of weeks, it felt like his chest was being ripped apart every time he coughed. And not long after that, he had started coughing up blood. He felt himself falling asleep again. He was so tired. Then he remembered. The cave. He had to tell someone about the cave. He struggled into a sitting position and reached for the nurse's bell. Ricky, Nathan, and Steve were already at the end of Adler Road by the time Sean and Kurt got there. Ricky showed the others his Swiss Army knife. What's that for? Asked Kurt. Be prepared, intoned Ricky. That's the scout motto. Steve rolled his eyes. Great. We'll call you if we need a fish scaled. Let's get going. They started up the road. Soon, they got to the trail that led up to the foothills and to the old man's shack. With mounting excitement, they continued. The nurse ran into the room. Mr. Collins, she said, prying his fingers from the bell. What's the matter? He grabbed at her wrist and tried to talk, but he felt that sharp, familiar feeling in his chest and began coughing. Only this time, he couldn't seem to stop. He held on to the nurse as his body shook and flecks of blood sprayed from his mouth. Mr. Collins, she said, frightened. Mr. Collins, let me get the doctor. He shook his head, and with a huge effort, he forced himself to stop. No, he gasped. Wait, my hut, the cave. He blacked out for a moment, and the nurse hit the intercom and asked for a doctor. The boys reached the field and marched bravely toward the far end. As they got closer to the shack, some of their courage leaked away, and they moved slower. What if he's been released? Asked Kurt. No way, said Sean. My sister said they'll have to monitor him for at least 24 hours. But what if there's someone else in there? Whispered Steve. They stopped a few feet in front of the shack. Hello? Called Ricky. Anybody home? They waited, their nerves on edge, but all was silent. The one window of the shack was dark and empty. Come on, said Ricky suddenly. He strode forward before the others could react and pulled open the door. They all braced themselves for some kind of howling demon to rush out and devour Ricky, but nothing happened. The other boys edged closer. Hey, said Ricky, look at that. Kurt couldn't believe it. The back wall of the shack had a door in it, yet the back wall was up against the hillside. You see, said Nathan proudly, I was right. He did find a gold mine. The rest of the hut was quickly examined and judged worthless. There was nothing in it but an old chest of drawers and some scraps of clothing, a small table and a bed. A bowl with some shriveled fruit in it sat on the table. Ricky positioned himself in front of the back door. It had a bar across it that could barely be lifted off. He looked at the other boys. Ready, men? Old man Collins swung his mind out of the blackness. The nurse was there, explaining to the doctor why she had called him. The doctor leaned over him. Mr. Collins, he said gently, you're in pretty bad shape. Doesn't matter, he gasped. My hut. Your hut will be fine. The doctor tried to calm him. Now, please, try to relax. Mr. Collins grabbed at the doctor's arm, but his strength failed him. He began coughing again. This time, he felt something tear in his chest, and after a sharp pain, there was nothing. His vision grew dimmer, and his hand slipped from the doctor's arm. He was no longer in the hospital room. Instead, he floated over the field where his hut stood. Then he was inside the hut, watching as the boys approached the back door. No! He yelled. Get away from there! But they couldn't hear him. Ready, men? He heard one of the boys say. The boy grabbed the bar across the back door. Stay away! The old man yelled again. I'm trying to protect you. Get out of there! It was no use. The boy slid the bar to the side and threw open the door. Behind the door was the dark mouth of a cave. As one, the boys pushed forward to peer inside. Then each of them felt an invisible force grab at them with terrible strength and pull them deeper inside the cave. No! Screamed Mr. Collins with all his might. It was the last thing he ever said. What was he yelling about, Doctor? The nurse asked as she looked down at the dead body of Mr. Collins. Delirium, answered the doctor. Who knows what they see just before they go?